How is it going, everybody? My name is Anton Dybal, also known as a skeptical human on YouTube. And joining me today is an absolute legend in the skeptical community. His book, Escaping the Rabbit Hole, has been recommended by such notable figures as Stephen Fry, David Pakman, and Michael Shermer of Skeptic Magazine. He's the founder of metabunk.org, which is a forum dedicated to the scientific investigation and debunking of a wide variety of claims. And it's a website that I personally find myself frequently referencing in my long-form debunking videos on conspiracy theories. In a world of anonymous, insult-laden internet comments, his commitment to respectful yet substantive dialogue sets him apart from many of his contemporaries. He's also one of 3 co-founders of the video game studio Neversoft, and he was heavily involved in programming for the Tony Hawk Pro Skater video game series, which I personally played a lot of growing up as a kid. Please join me in welcoming the man whose appearances on the Joe Rogan Experience have over 2.6 million views on YouTube, Mick West.
Well, thank you for that intro, Anton. That's quite impressive. I don't think I've had such a good introduction before.
Yeah. I just wanted to make it interesting for the viewers, give a little background information and all that. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great.
So let's go ahead and start our conversation by discussing the 9/11 truth movements.
Sure.
What are your general thoughts about the movement overall, the arguments they make, and so forth?
Well, it's a pretty old movement, obviously, because it's about a conspiracy theory that started pretty much on the day, on 2001, September the 11th. And I think it's kind of showing its age to a degree. The conspiracy theory is kind of recycling the same stuff over and over again. And they're trying to, do new things to stay relevant, but really they don't really have any new arguments. And I think they're basically just gradually declining. The people who are kind of interested in it realize that it's not going anywhere, even if they personally believe that there's something behind it, and they're kind of moving on to other things. And of course, a lot of people are realizing that the original claims didn't really have very much merit, and they've just basically drifted away from the movement. But it's one of those things that's going to stay around forever. You can't get rid of these perennial conspiracy theories. Like you think about the JFK assassination conspiracy theories, they've been around for a long time, since the, pretty much the day of the event, and they will continue to be around in the future.
Yeah, my general assessment is that we have all these stereotypes about conspiracy theorists where people like to poke fun at them like they're crazy people in tinfoil hats and they're, paranoid lunatics in padded cells and stuff like that. And really, when you actually talk to conspiracy theorists and know them personally, you find out that that's really not the case in most cases. They're just ordinary people who I would simply say have inaccurate beliefs on these questions.
Sure, yeah. They're not just, I wouldn't just describe them as, well, they are ordinary people, but what they do is they represent the whole range of ordinary people. So you get just regular, old guys who like to potter around doing stuff like investigating things, and you get young radical activists who feel like they're fighting against the man, and they've just discovered this new fight that they can get the grips on. And you get people who are somewhat a little bit out there, and they have more extreme theories. And then you have people who just have, they think it's just an extension of geopolitics. So there's a whole range of people, just like you find in any kind of interest.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely a whole spectrum. And, we have this one term, 9/11 truther, but it really encapsulates a whole broad, diverse set of viewpoints, ranging from, on the one hand, you have the people who pretty much just say, like, well, the collapse actually happened as described in the official story, but perhaps George Bush and Cheney had some foreknowledge and let it happen so that they could take advantage. Then you have the more conventional truthers who subscribe to, the controlled demolition viewpoints. And then all the way on this end, you have the people in the Judy Wood camp who say things like, there were space lasers from some advanced weaponry that turn the towers to dust. And really, this one term I think doesn't do justice to all these different viewpoints. But we're kind of limited by our language.
Yeah, but we don't really have to be limited by that. I mean, labeling people as a 9/11 truther, to some degree, I think is a mistake. Like you got to try to figure out what they actually believe in. Because there's a huge difference between someone who just thinks that George Bush let it happen and someone who believes that explosives were pre-planted in the towers and planes were flown in by remote controls. So we actually, these divisions within 9/11 truth, there's the 9/11 controlled demolition, and you could maybe call someone, a believer in the 9/11 controlled demolition theory, which is a bit more cumbersome, but at least you're being accurate in you describing their motives. And you could say there's no planers, for example, people who don't believe
Right.
planes hit either just the Pentagon, or people who don't think planes even hit the towers, which is completely ridiculous. But you don't want to lump everybody in the same boat and discredit people by association.
Right. Now, something you talk a lot about in your book, Escaping the Rabbit Hole, is the general process that a lot of people take in escaping these conspiratorial beliefs. And obviously, it's going to vary case to case. But as a general rule, in your experience studying the subject and writing about it, what does this process tend to look like?
For people getting into the rabbit hole, like it pretty much always now starts out with someone watching a video.
Right.
And when I ask people what their origin story was, so to speak, then they almost always start with, like, they say, I watched Loose Change, or I watched Zeitgeist, or I watched 9/11 in New Pearl Harbor, or one of those videos. So, in the days before YouTube, people were more likely to get it from like reading something, like they would read it in a book or a newsletter or something like that. But now they watch videos, and it becomes really, really easy for people to get sucked in. There's much less effort that they have to do. They could just happen to be late at night, just browsing YouTube, and then they click on something, and then they fall down a rabbit hole. Whereas before, they would actually have to go to the library or talk to somebody or subscribe to a newsletter. So there's less friction now. But once they've taken that initial step down the rabbit hole, what happens? What happens? What used to happen in the past, doesn't happen quite so much now, is that YouTube will suggest other videos. And YouTube was actually pulling people down the rabbit hole by, once it is figured out you like this type of video, it will show you another video along the same lines. This is something YouTube has actually realized is a bad thing, and they've actually changed their algorithms. First of all, they don't show people so much of that type of video in the first place, and they don't necessarily give you another similar video. But that's definitely been the experience of a lot of people, and a lot of people who are stuck down the rabbit hole now. It's going to be interesting to see how it changes in the future, but it's definitely what's happened in the past.
Yeah, my personal experience as a 9/11 truther in the past really does mirror that process you talk about there. Probably between the ages of, I'd say, like 14 to 17 years old or so, 14 to 16, something like that. I was a very passionate 9/11 truther. I wasn't just like the casual person who watched a documentary one time and was just like, yeah, I think there's something fishy going on here. I was completely obsessed with the subject. I knew all the arguments top to bottom. I virtually every single day I was on the forum above Top Secret in the 9/11 forum, posting about it, debating with people and so forth. I was totally obsessed with the subject, and really that is how it started out for me. Is I just watched a documentary. I don't know if it was Loose Change was the first one I saw, but that was definitely one in my armory, so to speak, of references I would point people to.
It's a big one.
I was definitely. I was a really big fan of the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth documentaries, because that specifically gives you a lot of credibility when you say, look, we have thousands of people who are experts in this field who are saying, it's a controlled demolition, and look at this. And I was totally obsessed with the subject. And one thing you notice when you talk to 9/11 truthers is that they often have this frustration and this apparent belief that anyone who doesn't agree with them clearly hasn't seen the evidence, they haven't watched the documentaries, they're not familiar with the arguments. Because I know personally, my viewpoint at the time was like, if you thoroughly study the subject, the only conclusion you can come away with is the fact that it was a controlled demolition. It was totally inconceivable to me to think that somebody could look at all this evidence, find it unconvincing, and not share my viewpoint. And that's why you hear so many people say things like, oh, this person disagreeing with me, they're clearly some kind of paid shill, because there's a sort of disbelief that, like, how can you look at all this and find it not convincing? Really, for me, what got me out of the rabbit hole was just a general improvement of my critical thinking skills overall, not necessarily in this one space. At the time, I was really interested in the whole atheism versus religion debate. I would watch a lot of stuff on that, read a lot of books on the subject. And from there, I sort of segued into more general skepticism on like pseudoscience and things like that. And I think it just made me overall a better critical thinker, more skeptical. And once I began to apply that that general pattern of thinking to the 9/11 truth beliefs, they just sort of whittled away. And for me, it was literally one day. I was like, I'm gonna relook at this. I'm gonna revisit this. I watched some documentaries that presented the so-called official story in their own words and not like transmitted to you secondhand by a truther who's sort of painting it in like a non-charitable way, but actually hearing, like here's a specific explanation for how the collapse could have been initiated and so forth, and just applying that critical thinking template to the truth or beliefs. I just had sort of this revelation that night where I was like, I don't really believe this stuff anymore, and for me, that was it.
Yeah, and that's it's a great like process you went through there, and like what you said earlier about people not being able to understand how you couldn't believe 9/11. That's something that happens to me a lot. Like people, when they first meet me, and I give them some argument, they don't know anything about me, and then they will say like, well, look at this, and they'll show me other things, and they think that they can convince me because all they have to do is show me this information, and they always go through this process where first of all they think that I don't know things. They think that I'm just ignorant about the facts, and when they figure out that I do know what the facts are, then they start calling me a shill.
Yep.
Or they go for a kind of, they can branch here. They can either call you a shill or they can call you an idiot, and then they could go down the idiot
even worse,
route
both.
a little bit. Yeah, they could go down the idiot route a bit, and then you start showing them more and more stuff and show them that you do actually understand it. And then they start just calling you a shill and you're not an idiot. But hopefully if you keep going long enough and you can engage them in a constructive way, then eventually you can make you make a difference. But I'm sure you've had the experience of going down that route and people just basically rejecting you at the end of it.
All the time. Yeah, every 9/11 video I've posted on my channel where I'm debunking their arguments, I take my time, I'm very thorough, I'm careful to represent their position accurately and explain what I think are the flaws. And instead of engaging with the arguments I make, I get two responses that are most common. One is simply accusations that I'm a paid shill, and the other is the common retort, what about Building 7? Doesn't matter what I'm talking about. I could be talking about the Molten Steel argument or the Thermite chips argument. What about Building 7? I say, hey, how's it going today? They're like, what about Building 7? Like, it doesn't matter what you say to these people. That it seems like those are their two go-tos.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of people that you talk to don't really have that deep of an understanding of the Building 7 stuff. And you look at stuff like now, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth have come out with this new study, which is like, kind of advanced level 9/11 truth. And the vast majority of people, they're probably not going to read the study and they don't really understand the various issues involved. They just have this fairly simplistic view on things. And they say Building 7 looked like a controlled demolition. Therefore, it must have been, or they'll say, it fell at free fall speed. Therefore, it was a controlled demolition. And they have this very, very simplistic understanding of it. And it's difficult to get people to move beyond that. It's kind of like a challenge to actually, move people beyond these simple understandings and their simple reliance on the authorities of others. Like they say, architects and engineers say this, and that's good enough for me. But they don't talk about all the other architects and engineers who say the opposite thing.
Yeah, something I often point out to truthers, sort of tongue-in-cheek, whenever they say, like, oh, you're a paid shill. I'm like, look, if you guys had any idea how little I make from YouTube, especially given the amount of time I put into my YouTube videos, you'd almost wish I was a paid shill, And it's like, I invite people to ask themselves, I'm like, what would this process look like to you? Like, the director of the CIA is sitting at home, he sees one of my YouTube videos, and he sends an agent to come knock on my door and just, offer to pay me money to lie about 9/11, and I'm just like, yes, it's an excellent plan. Like, if you actually walk through what the stages would be of turning somebody into a paid shill, it seems ridiculous. On its face. And another question I invite people to ask themselves is, how do you differentiate between somebody who's a so-called paid shill and somebody who simply disagrees with you on the facts and is being vocal about that? From what I've seen, they have no process to distinguish between the two. There's no evaluative series of steps they go through. They simply assume that anyone who disagrees with them vocally is a paid shill. And I think that's obviously a pretty fundamental mistake they make.
Yeah, and I always try to be as open with people as possible to try to convince that I'm not a paid shill. I mean, I tell them like I made money making the Tony Hawk video games, and if you look at my YouTube channel, it's not monetized. I actually got demonetized like a year ago because I had some video that had a I can't remember what it was. It was the Jihadi John video, where some people were saying this video is fake because the shadows are wrong. So I posted the video to show that the shadows were in the right direction, and YouTube demonetized my entire channel because it was like I
Oh,
was
wow.
I was repeating terrorist propaganda, and I haven't really managed to get it remonetized. But then I only have 6,000 subscribers. If I'm like a paid shill, why isn't the government helping me get more subscribers and
Right.
monetizing my channel to pay me? It doesn't really make any sense that no one's really watching my videos, but you get thousands of people watching the 9/11 truth videos. It's kind of a backwards way of looking at things.
Yeah, something else to add to that in a similar vein is every single 9/11 truther debunking video I post instantly demonetized. Any attempt to overturn that, to request a manual review, gets rejected. So it's
It's a
very
problem.
difficult to actually make advertising money from this content, despite all the time and energy that goes into it. So the whole paid shill argument, I think it's really a dodge. Instead of engaging with the arguments, they just want to insult you and smear you and dismiss you. And before I forget about this, I just wanted to say one more thing about my past experience as a truther because I think it's very important. Um, I think the biggest mistake that I made at that time was living inside of an echo chamber. I was on the forums. I was, 95% of people agree with me. I was only looking at one side of the argument. I was watching all the documentaries. I was reading all the posts and the articles, but it was only on one side of the debate. So I like to think of it like a scale or a balance where like if you're only stacking stuff on one side of it, eventually it's going to tip over and start to lean in that direction.
Hmm.
And so what I would encourage people to actually look at it with an open mind, look at both sides of the argument, listen to people who are representing the so-called official story in their own words and not the distortions that you hear where people are sneering and framing it in a way that makes it look bad. And if you escape that echo chamber and I think look at both sides, it makes it a lot harder to maintain those views.
Yeah, and the analogy I like to use is one of a trial. Like, say you're going to a murder trial, and it's a bit up in the air, about who did it. There's eyewitnesses, but it's dubious. But you go to this trial, you're on the jury, and you're only ever allowed to look at the evidence for the prosecution. You only get one lawyer presenting evidence, and the defense doesn't get to present any evidence whatsoever. And if you only listen to one lawyer, that lawyer is going to convince you because normally in a trial you have two people, two lawyers or two teams of lawyers who are very, very skilled at presenting an argument. So one presents a very good argument for the defense, one presents a very good argument for the prosecution, and normally a jury's job is to listen to both of them and decide where the truth lies. And that's what people should be doing with the conspiracy theorists, well, 9/11 truth. They shouldn't just be listening to the evidence for the prosecution. They should also listen to the evidence for the defense and then make a decision based on the balance of that evidence and not just the evidence from one side.
Absolutely. I wanted to segue and talk about some actual specific arguments instead of just having, general conversations about the
Sure.
movements. And mostly I would like to focus on arguments centered around the claim that the collapse of the Twin Towers and Building 7 are controlled demolitions. Obviously, I'm sure we're going to enter some other territory and that's fine. But what's your general assessment of the truther arguments that if you look at the characteristics of the collapse of the Twin Towers, what you see are signs of controlled demolition?
Well, for a start, when you think about the towers collapsing, they don't look anything at all like a controlled demolition. They look like the building has collapsed from the top down. Controlled demolitions start from the bottom up. So if you're just looking at the Twin Towers, it looks like, what we were told happened, like planes threw into the building. Like we know planes flew into the building. We know there was a huge fire. There's photos of the fire. And because the building's so big, it's 200 feet across, it looks like the fire doesn't look that big. But when you actually get close to it, you see these walls of flame. They're actually like 30, 40 feet high. It's going over multiple floors. These are huge fires going over entire floors and, the damage from the planes. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. So it's not surprising at all that the top of the building would start to collapse. But then people they get a bit confused about why it collapsed so fast. And this is a difficult thing to explain to people. And it has to do with the scale of the buildings. The buildings were 200 feet wide and they're 1,300 feet tall. Very, very large buildings, completely beyond any of our human experience of things. Like you think about, Jenga towers and things like that, completely unrelated to the collapses of the World Trade Center. So you have to kind of get in there and understand the actual structure of the towers, like how the core is constructed, how the floors connect between the core and the outside walls, to really understand why it collapsed. But most people aren't going to really make that effort. And it becomes very difficult to actually explain it to people. They'll just say, oh, it fell too fast. And then you go, based on what? How do you think it should have fallen? And what do you think actually happened whilst the building was collapsing? And if you present these arguments gently to people, you can sometimes get through to them. You can explain to them that it wasn't the columns that collapsed initially. It was the floors that collapsed. And you can explain how the collapse was initiated by the floor trusses sagging and things like that. But it's difficult stuff to get across to people who are already convinced. I like to use physical examples wherever possible. I've got a YouTube video where I demonstrate the collapse mechanism of the towers. But I think, again, basically people have these very simplistic understandings and they use these simple arguments. And you kind of have to start there and then just try to introduce new stuff as gradually as possible and to show them, what really happened.
Yeah, a question I like to invite truthers to ask is, what would you expect a collapse of two towering skyscrapers to look like, if not the extremely messy collapse that we saw with the Twin Towers? You have dust going everywhere, all kinds of steel chunks flying off and stuff. And a point that you make in one of your posts on metabunk.org that I talk about in my video that focuses on the lateral debris ejection arguments, where truthers say, if you look at the ejection of multi-ton heavy steel beams, they're going horizontally, gravity works vertically, therefore there must be explosions propelling this stuff outward. A point you make in a post of yours is to propel massive, gigantic building chunks like this, where we're talking about, dozens of tons, heavy, massive steel girders, it would take an enormous quantity of explosions that would be complete overkill in any sensible controlled demolition. So, when you demolish a building in an actual controlled demolition, it's laser precise. You pinpoint specific structural beams. You use just enough explosions to get the job done. You're not trying to violently explode the building outward in this explosion that pulverizes concrete and sends steel beams flying. So I think when you look at it from that perspective, it's like it doesn't match up with a controlled demolition.
Yeah, and I mean, you're going to ask, like, why would they do that? Why would they actually make the things look like that if that's not why it would actually look like? The idea surely would be to try to simulate what the real collapse would look like, so they fool people. So they would be trying to do things that would look like what would actually happen. But we know that if you do actually figure out the physics, you can say that these things would happen. You would get these massive ejections of dust from the side because you've got the air being compressed, and you would get these members falling to the side for a number of reasons. One is simply that things pivot, like the outside sections of the wall. When they lost their interior support, they would pivot around the column beneath them. They would start to tilt, and that tilt would continue to the side. Things like individual girders would fall down, and because they're falling a free fall is slightly faster than the collapse, they eventually hit something that's solid. And if you drop something, like if you take like a steel bar and you drop it on something else that's steel, it could well bounce off, start spinning around and fly off to the side. Or it could just fall and it could pivot. Something pivoting from the top of a structure can actually goes a long way. So there's actually nothing physically impossible about these things. I think, again, they look strange because of the scale of things.
Right.
But then you get people trying to explain them in terms of propulsion from the explosives, which doesn't really make any sense. Like, even if you strapped rockets to these things, you would have to have a ridiculously large amount of rockets strapped to it to actually do it. And they have this weird idea that there was these panels of explosives in the middle and it pushed everything outwards. Why would you do that? Why would you try to collapse a building in this way? You wouldn't. You would stick some charges around some columns at the bottom and blow it up. So then, like I said, then they would say, well, they did it to make it look like a real collapse. And then, well, if that's the case, then it does look like a real collapse. And so what are you complaining about? You can't
Exactly,
really
and
have it
that
both
kind of
ways.
undermines, sorry to interrupt, but that kind of undermines their point where they're on the one hand they say, "Oh, it looks like a controlled demolition." Then you point out it doesn't and they're like, "Aha, that's because
Yeah.
it was their goal to not make it look like a demolition." So make your minds up, you know?
It's kind of like the flat Earth problem. Like with the flat Earth, you keep pointing out that the observations you see in the flat on the Earth make it look like it's a round Earth, like you see things going over the horizon. And the flat Earth argument becomes, oh well, it's flat. It just looks like it's a round Earth. So they
Right.
don't really have any argument other than they think that this is what it is, and everything that they see they fit into that argument. Like it looks like a controlled demolition. It looks like a regular collapse that was actually a controlled demolition that's fake to look like a regular collapse. It
Right.
doesn't really make any sense.
Yeah, it's the classic mistake of taking on way too many assumptions, way more assumptions than you need to actually explain the observations, which I think is one of the hallmarks of conspiracy theorists. One other thing I like to point out about controlled demolitions versus the Twin Towers collapse is the complete lack of the systematic pattern of explosions you hear in actual controlled demolitions. Watch any demolition of a very large building, whether it's like a casino being brought down or whatever,
Hmm.
and just before the collapse, it's not just like, oh, there was a boom like 2 minutes before that a firefighter reported or something like that. But it's like boom, 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 boom. It's like precisely timed. There's a pattern, unmistakably man-made, unmistakably there's, timers and charges going off. You simply don't see that with the collapse of the Twin Towers. And, you have truthers who point to, oh, the sounds of explosions. And maybe it's like there was a
Yeah.
loud boom here or like a crash there. Or maybe there even were some explosions. There could have been like, things inside of the buildings, like, common office supplies, like let's say you have like busted open windows in building 7, for example, and then you have cans of WD-40 in an office that are lit on fire, and they can explode, or you can fill in the blank here and think of like 10 different things you would find in a building that could cause some sort of localized explosions like that. But the complete lack of pattern, systematic controlled demolition explosions is I think uh, proof that they're wrong about that.
Yeah, and I think it's another area where they try to have it both ways. Like they try to say
Right.
there were these loud sounds of explosions, and then they say, oh well, we didn't need loud sounds of explosions because we used explosives that were quiet, which is another thing that doesn't make any sense. Like using nanothermite to do things like thermite, yeah, it burns quietly, but they're saying, well, we use special thermite, which is actually a kind of a high explosive, which burns rapidly. It actually explodes, but that would create noise. You would actually hear these explosions, and there'd be lots of other things. There's lots of other things that are missing from this. Like if you look at the debris pile, it doesn't look like the columns have been blown up by explosives. It certainly doesn't look like all these columns have been cut by nanothermite. It doesn't really make sense when you actually look at the debris pile. So kind of again, they have to come up with this really weird theory where the tower was literally blown apart from the inside, like there was these big kind of propulsions coming from the inside that pushed the beams. But it's really like the flat Earth thing, like saying light bends, and that's why the things look like they're around Earth. It's creating this ridiculous, complicated explanation for something that's actually really simple. The really simple explanation is that the top of the tower fell down. It kind of disintegrated. Individual floors can't support more than 6 to 12 times their own weight. The floors didn't really have any structural strength. Things fell through the floors, stripped away from the columns. Outside of the building fell away. Middle of the building was unsupported and then collapsed. It's very, very simple. It's not complicated at all. And yet, if you go the route of it being a controlled demolition, you have to jump through all these hoops to explain all these things. It just doesn't make any sense at all. And I think the challenge is to get people to actually look at it from an even-handed perspective rather than being just the witness for the prosecution type thing. If you can get them to actually consider this theory, the essentially the official story, with a degree of intellectual honesty, then they will eventually come around to it.
I think you said it very well when you said that they're trying to have it both ways in several different ways. A point that I like to make when analyzing the thermite hypothesis is it completely contradicts some of the other arguments that they make. On the one hand, they say, oh, the sounds of explosions are proof that there was a controlled demolition using conventional explosions. And then you point out the lack of systematic explosions, and they're like, aha, that's because thermite was used to silently melt the steel beams within the confines of the buildings to cover it up. They point to the ejection of lateral debris. They say this is proof that very powerful explosions were used to propel this stuff outwards. And then at the same time, they turn around and sorry, I'm trying to read my horrible handwriting here. And on the other hand, they turn around and they say, well, no, thermite was used to silently melt the steel beams in an incendiary type of demolition. So
Yeah.
I like to call it Schrodinger's demolition, where it's like simultaneously explosive and silent, simultaneously melting the steel beams and propelling them outwards. It's like you could be correct that there's a controlled demolition, but if your own claims are contradicting themselves, at least one of them has to be false.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like the sheer amount of stuff that they put in there that they feel that they need to explain. Like another thing is the dust clouds. When the building collapsed, there's these huge clouds of dust, and for some reason they couldn't understand why there would be these huge clouds of dust if it wasn't a controlled demolition. And so they come up with this theory where the concrete of every single floor was turned to dust in midair. You know, some of the more extreme theories have the steel turning to dust as well, which is physically impossible. But some of them say the concrete was turned to dust, so they must have used explosives to turn the concrete to dust. But yeah, that's completely unnecessary explanation. All that dust is stuff that you would expect to see. If you look at things like buildings that collapse after an earthquake, you get huge clouds of dust. If
Right.
you look at rock falls in some national parks, people go and sometimes they see a rock fall, and that's just purely gravity, and it's just rock, and you get a huge cloud of dust. The idea that the towers actually turned to dust is almost like a bit of weird mythology that somehow inserted itself into 9/11 truth like a decade ago, and people have got stuck with it, and so they're having to try to constantly use that. It's the same thing with nanothermite. I don't know if you know the history of nanothermite. I talk about it a bit in my book, but it originally kind of came about because they were confused about why the core of the tower, like half of the core of the tower, remained standing. I think it's the North Tower, for a few seconds after the rest of the tower
Right.
had collapsed. So, the building had already fallen to the ground, but the core was remaining. And they thought, why wouldn't this tower, the middle of the tower, collapse? And they thought, well, the plan was obviously to have it collapse later, but how did they do that? And they said what happened was all the thermite that they'd used to destroy the top part of the tower, had formed into this big pool of molten iron at the bottom, and that molten iron had melted the bottom of the columns, and then it had collapsed. So they kind of inserted this thermite theory so they could explain the collapses of the core, but then they kind of got stuck with it. Then they just kind of became like, thermite fans. And the guy who originally came up with this, he was a big thermite guy. He thought that, I think it was TWA Flight 800 or some other flight disaster was caused by thermite. And, he thinks thermite was used in various other places. So it's this mythology has arisen around 9/11 truth, and people get stuck in the mythology, and they're just trying to fit all the facts into that mythology rather than actually trying to figure out what's going on. So with this molten metal falling out of the side of the building, there is a very simple explanation for that, and it's actually an explanation that NIST give in the FAQ, their online FAQ. I can't remember which one it is, but there's so much stuff in these NIST FAQs, and I think one of the best things you can actually do is try to get 9/11 truthers to read these online frequently asked questions. There's one about Building 7 specifically, and then there's one about the collapses of the towers. And they explain why there looks like there's molten metal pouring out the side of the building, and they say it's probably something like molten aluminum with this burning material inside it. And this is something that I think the 9/11 truthers are kind of aware of this explanation, but they reject it. And they often reject these things because they do like little experiments themselves. Like, first of all, they will say, yeah, molten aluminum doesn't glow, which is kind of true. unless you heat it up to the same temperature as molten iron, is not going to glow the same. Even then, it usually forms a skin which prevents it from glowing. So that some of them will stop there and say, "Oh, it can't be molten aluminum because it doesn't glow." But then you say, "Oh well, but it's like got material entrained in it, so it's burning material in there." And they say, "Well, I kind of tried that and it didn't work." But they won't show you what they actually tried. They didn't have a huge vat of molten aluminum with office chairs and things in it, like burning away and then tossing it off the side of a building. They would do something like, put a bit of cloth into a bit of molten aluminum and see what happens. But the explanations are there, and this is something that you come across again and again in this type of thing, in conspiracy theories and debunking conspiracy theories, and I'm sure you've seen it, and it's something you realize yourself when you started to look into it, is that there are actually good explanations for all the questions that the conspiracy theorists have out there. And to a large extent, either they're just not aware that these explanations even exist, or they've kind of given a very superficial dismissal of the explanation without really giving it an honest evaluation. And the challenge is really to try to get that across to people. And with 9/11, get people to read the FAQ, or get them at least to read the one or two questions in that FAQ and the answers that address their primary concerns.
Yeah, regarding the molten steel, as they call it, number one, who actually collected samples of this and tested it to ascertain that it is molten steel? This is nothing more than an assumption they're making, and I think it's an unfounded one when you consider that the exact location that we see it dripping out of in the video, that's exactly where a lot of the debris from the airplane crash was pushed after the plane smashed into the buildings. That's where fires were raging. So it makes perfect sense that, the thousands of tons of aluminum that comprise an airplane would have simply melted as a result of the fires that were raging. Because you look at the temperatures of traditional building fires, and they're more than capable of melting aluminum. And something I point out in my analysis of the molten steel arguments is that if you actually heat molten aluminum hot enough, it does glow bright orange. Like at relatively low molten temperatures, yes, it's a silvery color, and truthers are quick to point that out. But I show several video clips in that video of people who heat it up. There's one guy who pours it in like a shredding machine for some reason. I don't know why, but it's a YouTube channel where some guy just does this. He heats it up, and it's clearly a bright orange color. I show another video clip from a factory where they heat aluminum to the point where it's molten, and they're pouring it in some kind of mold to create something. It's some kind of factory, and you see the whole process where they take the aluminum scraps, you see them pour it into the blast furnace, you see it come out molten, and again, it's a bright orange color. So we don't even have to go with what I call the burning log hypothesis, because if you look at the temperatures in building fires and compare it against video footage of aluminum heated to those temperatures, you see that it can actually glow bright orange. And I don't see any testing results that show this is molten steel. All they're doing is just assuming it.
Yeah, I think I would personally go with the burning log hypothesis myself. I think that the temperatures involved and the fact that it was in daylight isn't really like commensurate with glowing aluminum. But aluminum does glow if you heat it hot enough. But I think here it is probably more likely, like Nis say, that it is actually this debris. But yeah, the people say, why was molten iron or molten steel found at the World Trade Center site? And like you said, it wasn't. There's no evidence whatsoever that there was any molten steel at the World Trade Center site. People talk about there being rivers of molten steel underground, which is, if there were rivers of molten steel underground, like supposedly days after the event, where are the huge solidified pools of molten steel? Like if you burn thermite, what happens is that it creates iron, but that iron will go down to the bottom of whatever the container is, and it will form a pool. It will sink to the bottom. So you should have had these large lumps of iron. Like I've got like a bit of thermite. I've got a bit of thermite that I burnt myself in a flower pot, and it forms this slag on top, and all the iron sinks to the bottom, and you get these very solid pieces of actual iron, and nothing like that was found. If there was in fact hundreds of tons of thermite being used, then you would have got significant accretions of iron somewhere within the building, but nothing was found. people talk about there's a lump of stuff called the
The
meteorite.
meteorites. Yep.
Yeah, but that's not molten iron. There's no molten iron in there. You can see bits of rebar sticking out of it. You can see
Exactly.
pieces of paper lying on the surface. It's just a bunch of compressed and burnt concrete and rebar and various bits and pieces. So there's no molten iron. But it's another thing that's become part of the mythology. And it's something that shall not be questioned. It's like, oh, we've already established that there's molten steel, there's molten iron, and there was lots of it. It was flowing down in rivers. And so now we have to come up with some explanation for it. And the only explanation we can think of is that there was thermite being used to melt the beams and to create all this iron by itself. But they're creating explanations for something that doesn't need explaining because there's no actual evidence of it happening. Sure, there was molten metal, but there's lots of metal in the towers that melts at a much lower temperature. There's lots of aluminum for a start. There was the plane made of aluminum, and then there was all the cladding around the outside, which would have been in the pile afterwards. And then there was things like lead from the various battery banks that they had within the tower. There was lots of big uninterruptible power supplies that had lots of banks of lead acid batteries that would have melted at a very low temperature, created molten metal, which may well look like molten steel if you don't go and analyze it. So if you're just basing it on a few visual accounts from people that there was molten metal, that's not evidence of molten steel. And this is something that you've got to kind of hammer home to people. You've got to let them know that, no, there's no evidence of molten steel. Why are you continually raising this molten steel thing and then positing all these explanations for something for which you've got no evidence of even happening in the first place? Why are you bothering with molten steel when you don't even know if there was any there?
Yeah, regarding the meteorite specifically, Stephen Jones, he's fond of pointing out that, oh, the presence of rust on the surface is proof that it was previously molten steel. And I look at that and I'm like, that's no more proof that the entire thing is made of steel than you go out on your patio that's made of concrete and you find rust stains from some
Yeah,
metal patio furniture. And you say,
exactly. It's a
therefore, the
rust stain.
underlying concrete is all made of steel. It's fundamentally illogical. And you absolutely nailed it when you say there are chunks of solid rebar sticking out. So how are you going to point to this thing and say it must have all been previously molten steel when there are clearly chunks of steel that never was hot enough to become molten? It's a contradiction that none of them
Yeah.
seem interested in explaining or even acknowledging.
Yeah, I've actually seen that meteorite. They used to have it in the Memorial Museum. It wasn't there the last time I went. But, it's just a bunch of concrete and bits of building material. And concrete doesn't melt. Concrete kind of decomposes into its constituent parts, and you don't really get like molten concrete. But what you see there is just still original concrete and original steel that's just being compressed, and it's got like burn marks on it and stuff. But it's just a bit of building that is being squashed.
If you look at the video footage of the so-called molten steel dripping out of the tower and you look closely at it, you notice something interesting, and that's that it's not coming off of the steel beams. It's coming out of the window, which I think actually undermines their hypothesis. Because what they're saying is they're like, no, the actual steel beams themselves were rigged up with thermite charges and cut through. But if the thermite is pouring out of the window, that means, it's not originating from the steel beam. And I invite
Yeah,
truthers to ask themselves, why do we only see it in this one location? Their hypothesis is no, the whole building was rigged up. There were thermite charges everywhere. You're not going to bring a building down by just severing one exterior column on the outside when there's a bunch of, redundancies are built into buildings like this, where if there's like one
yeah,
failure or even a couple exterior columns, the whole thing's not going to fail. So you look at thermite reactions actually taking place. It's extremely bright, bright orange, impossible to miss. Why would we not see that all over the building at all the different floors where they say these thermite reactions are taking
yeah.
place? The fact that it's only coming from this one spot, I think, supports the molten aluminum hypothesis.
Yeah, it's not even just bright orange. It's actually bright white. It's almost like this incandescent light. Like when I was doing my thermite experiments, I was using a welding mask because it's such a bright light. You could probably get sunburn from it because it's ridiculously bright. And if you see this in any, if you look at MythBusters when they cut a car in half with thermite or something like that, you see that the camera just instantly stops down, so everything around it becomes dark, so you can actually focus on the actual thing, because it's such a bright event. So you would actually see it would probably be bright enough so you could see it through the windows of the building. You would be able to, it would be kind of illuminating the building from the inside, especially on the side of the building that was in shade from the sun. And you didn't see anything like that. There was no bright lights. So, obviously it was some kind of magic nanothermite that didn't make bright lights. But, again, you're having to create additional layers of explanation to explain away a lack of evidence for something that there wasn't evidence for in the first place. So you're getting this convoluted layer upon layer of explanation that isn't necessary when you've got a perfectly simple explanation, which is that the building was hit by a plane, it caught on fire, the fire insulation was knocked off the columns, the fires heated the columns and the beams and pulled in the outside, and it collapsed. It's not that complicated. And if you just reject the simple explanation, then you're going to have to just basically invent a ridiculous explanation. And because that ridiculous explanation isn't going to actually fit the facts, you're going to have to constantly convolute it and make it more and more involved and ridiculous. And that's really what's happened with 9/11 Truth. Over the years, you got this convoluted mythology that's grown up that people are forced to try and defend. And eventually people see that, and then they move away from the 9/11 Truth movement because they figure it out.
Yeah, one final major flaw I see with the molten steel dripping out of the tower argument is what we're told is, no, it was the interior columns that were rigged up, because they say to us, oh, there were elevator shafts that were accessible and they were doing some renovations at the time. Mm-hmm. So clearly that means the sinister people in charge of the conspiracy sent people in who were dressed up as engineer technicians to rig up those concealed interior columns, because the columns on the outside, that was just like a part of the office space. You're in your office, and it's like that. Those are just like the exterior walls with windows in between. So it'd be very difficult to rig those up with thermite charges. And so they're pointing to something happening on the exterior corner of the building as proof that concealed on the inside there are thermite reactions going on. So again, it gets back to that point I made earlier, where it's just there are all kinds of contradictions between different claims they're making, and they don't seem to notice it or care to explain it.
Yeah, I think people would try to explain it. Like they would say, like the plane knocked some charges off the middle of the building, and they ended up on the outside of the building. But again, right. You're having to come up with a very, very specific explanation for something that doesn't really need any explanation. There was a big fire. Big fire in a building that had aluminum in, and that would cause a flow of molten aluminum at some point. Flows of molten aluminum are seen in regular house fires. Window frames melt, and the aluminum falls down from these window frames. So this is something that is expected to happen in a fire, and we knew that there was a fire. End of story.
Yeah, there's a certain point where I think you have to reach where it's like, okay, maybe it's sorry, there's a fruit fly in here. Maybe it's conceivably possible that all of these different assumptions that you're stacking on top of one another. There are thermite charges. They were concealed. One of them was blown into the corner, and then it happened to react somehow in the corner. And that's what we see happening. Like, maybe it's conceivably possible that all of these different assumptions stacked on top of one another are actually the case. But I feel like there's a certain point where you need to stop and ask yourself, are all of these layers of assumptions correct, or am I simply wrong about the facts, and am I just digging myself deeper into a hole to save face? Because I refuse to admit that.
Yeah, and you've really got to go to Occam's razor here, which
right.
Is often stated as being the simplest explanation is the best, but really the Occam's razor is the explanation that introduces the fewest new things or requires the fewest new things is the actual most likely thing to be correct. Like do not multiply explanations beyond what is necessary, I think is what the actual saying is. And we have, from the start, we have a good explanation that it was a fire that damaged the building and it collapsed. But with all these other things, you have to have this ridiculous amount of new things that go in there. You have to have these nanothermites. You have to have the planes somehow being flown in at exactly the right spot. Then you have to have the somehow it's synchronized so that the fires burn for an hour and then they set off these charges, and then you have to have all these charges going off at exactly the right point somehow without without any kind of wiring in there. They're all somehow done wirelessly or by some kind of hand-waving magic. And it's a type of explosive that has never been used for demolition before and isn't actually used for anything. And it's something that's like it's just a vague theoretical thing that doesn't even really exist. And they've just used it for this one instance, and nothing else. So you've got on one hand this simple explanation, planes hitting, fire, collapse, and then you've got this ridiculously convoluted explanation on the other side. And if you were William Ockham, you'd look at these two things and you go, that's a bunch of nonsense. Let's go with the simple, obvious explanation. Why are you going for this really, really complicated explanation?
Absolutely. I think you nailed it there. And you know what's especially amusing to me is for some, the thermite charges aren't good enough. Some say there was actually some sort of secretly designed spray-on nanothermite that was painted onto the steel beams in some sort of secret lab, I guess. They're developing technology like this. And they came up with this never before used demolition technology. And they sprayed it on and somehow ignited it. And I guess that was enough to sever these extremely thick steel beams.
Yeah, it's that they're just kind of departing from physics there, because if you're spraying something on, it's a very thin layer, and there's just not going to be enough energy to do anything there. And if it's sprayed on, what's it actually going to do? It's going to burn off. Right. Even if it burns off very, very rapidly, and you think it's going to push the columns. How does it actually work? How does it? What do they just do the columns on one side and it pushes them all outside? The amount of energy you get from a spray-on thing isn't very much. You're talking about think of a sparkler, fireworks sparkler. That's actually made from thermite, and the amount of energy. Yeah, it's a kind of thermite, and they put magnesium in it as well to get the little sparks. Actually, maybe it's aluminum actually, but yeah, it's a type of thermite. It burns very hot. If you ever use a sparkler, you see the actual metal pole in the middle actually bends sometimes from the heat. But the amount of energy in thermite, it isn't that much. And if you actually reformulate it as an explosive, the actual amount of energy you get out of it is even less. And the idea of demolishing a building by painting the explosives on one side of a column just makes no sense whatsoever. It's not going to work. It's the amount of energy is and how do you actually get it all to go off at the same time? What's the actual wiring that's connecting these things, and how do they manage to synchronize it all? It's this kind of convoluted magic that you have to come up with to explain it. And I think they get away with it because they say, oh, we don't know exactly how it was done. And this is kind of how the flat earthers do things. I'm not saying they're like flat earthers, but there's similar thinking going on. With flat earth, they say, oh, we don't know exactly what shape the earth is, but we know it's not a spinning ball, because the spinning ball has so many logical problems with it. And the 9/11 truthers will say, we don't know exactly how the nanothermite was applied. We don't know exactly how the building collapsed, but we know it wasn't a gravity-driven collapse. So in a way, pointing out all these ridiculous parts of the nanothermite hypothesis is not going to convince people, because they will say, oh, we just don't know exactly how they did it, but they must have used some advanced technology, and they can always get around by saying we're not actually giving you a hypothesis. Like the flat earthers say, we're not going to give you a map of our flat earth because we don't know what it is, we just know it's not a ball. So then you have to address the actual fundamental question is why do they reject the gravity-driven hypothesis? And then I think it's much more fruitful to get back to explaining how the buildings could actually have collapsed under gravity with the floors being stripped away from the columns.
Yeah, there's the famous Niels Harrit et al. Paper that's often tossed around in the truther community. It's extensively cited in the Architects and AE 9/11 Truth documentaries. Any forum you go to, it's going to be a staple on there. And what they argue in the paper is, well, there's actually tangible, concrete evidence that this spray-on nanothermite was used. If you simply look in the dust, you collect these little red chips of the spray-on nanothermites. And if you actually test it and analyze it, you find that it matches up with the composition of the primer paint, which happen to be the same red color. So again, it gets back to what we talked about earlier, where it's like, okay, there's the simple explanation on the one hand, or there's the convoluted one. And which one are we going to go with?
Yeah, these red gray chips, it's quite amazing, really, because they look exactly like primer paint that has been flaked off something by mechanical force. I have a wheelbarrow, a red wheelbarrow out in my backyard. So and it's a kind of a rusty old thing that I don't use. And I hit it with a hammer, and I collected the chips that came off it. And I looked at them under a microscope, and they look exactly the same as these red gray chips. They're this kind of dull red on one side, and they're gray on the other side from where they were in contact with the steel, and this oxidized the steel. And if you look at what they claim to be the chemical analysis of these things, they say, it's iron oxide on one side. Iron oxide is rust. That's what you're going to get on the backside of a paint chip that's come off a piece of steel. On the front side, there's these various things, and they match the types of compositions of things that you have in paint. You get aluminum in paint because it's you get, I say, aluminum. I can't remember where it is now.
Aluminum silicate.
Yeah, which is like rock essentially. But things like that. There's just compositions of things that they use in various types of paint, and primer paint often uses iron oxide in it as well because it's the red color. And if you go to the Memorial Museum or any 9/11 memorial, you will see this red paint on these iron beams and things. And I was really struck actually when I went to the 9/11 Memorial Museum last time. I wanted to check this specifically. So I looked at one of the columns. There's one that's right just around the corner from the stairs as you go down. And it's exactly the same color as my real wheelbarrow because it's just using the same type of paint that people use, primer paint that they put on steel to protect it from the elements. And it has this red kind of iron oxide color. And I wish I could have. I was looking around on the floor in the Memorial Museum to see if there was any little flakes that had fallen off it, but unfortunately I couldn't find any, and I didn't really want to be like banging on it with my hammer. But I know it's the exact same stuff that was.
They'd be like, "What's that crazy guy doing over there?"
I know. The guards were kind of looking at me suspiciously because I was already leaning over the guardrail to try to get a close look at this red paint. But yeah, it's the same. It's the same red paint. They'll tell you that it doesn't match the exact composition, but there was lots of different compositions of paint used, and some of them they didn't say what they actually were, and it was probably more from the trusses rather than the columns themselves, because the trusses were completely covered in this red paint as well, and they got so mangled by the falling things that everything got snapped off them. There are explanations for these things. And they just latched onto this paint chip thing as being this magical explanation that fits their world, when really it just fits the paint explanation, which is super simple.
One of the claims they make in that paper is that, well, if you analyze the composition, 3 specific elements are missing. You have the magnesium, you have the chromates, and you have the zinc that are simply not there. But if you look at their own chemical analysis in the paper, you see that all 3 of them are there. And then they switch it to in another paper. Well, no, it's simply that there aren't large enough quantities of these elements, and that's what distinguishes it from the primer paint. And as you pointed out, there were several different primer paints used. I think there were like 7 different companies that supplied steel to these buildings, all of which could have used different primer paint recipes. So who knows if the paint that they're comparing these chips against is even the one that was actually on the chips.
Yeah, they should go and test some of the actual steel. There actually is a bunch of public 9/11 memorials where they have like these various beams. And because they're just out in the open, you could probably go and just take a bit of tape and take some of the paint off and get it tested and see what it is. I would do it myself if there was one close enough to me. But you're gonna find that these red gray chips. Yeah, it was so amazing to me that it just looks exactly the same as a regular paint chip. And then they had these tests where they burnt it, and they said like it had this thermitic reaction. But when they burnt it in oxygen. Now thermite burns in in a vacuum because it's got its own source of oxygen. It's got its iron oxide and aluminum powder, or there's various other compositions, but they all have their own oxide in there. But they burnt it in oxygen, and it actually produced more energy than you would expect from thermite. And it seems like what was actually burning was the kind of the organic binder in the paint. And I've taken some of my paint chips and I burnt them. I've ignited them, stuck them in a little metal pan and heated it from the bottom until it ignited. And they burn. And I actually found little iron microspheres in, which is another thing they say is evidence. If you burn these paint chips, it creates iron microspheres. Well, yeah, if you burn any kind of like fine iron dust, it creates iron microspheres. This is just something you expect to find in a fire, especially if you've got like a bunch of dust, a bunch of iron dust, which you would after the buildings collapsed because of the huge amounts of mechanical damage done to the buildings. So, again, these are just simple things like that you would expect to find, but because they're so focused on using this as an explanation for their theory, they just instantly reject any kind of conventional explanation. Like the iron microspheres. I spent a lot of time like explaining how you can make iron microspheres and why you would expect to find them in the debris of the building, but it kind of falls on deaf ears because they just like this explanation so much. And the fact that if you can burn these chips like regular paint chips from my wheelbarrow and make iron microspheres, that just kind of throws the whole theory out the window that they are some kind of thermite because they make iron microspheres, and yet they still use this explanation. Many years after they first suggested it, and many years after people have pointed out the flaws in it. I think it's one of those things that just enters the mythology. It won't go away, but people will realize over time that it really is not a very good argument. If they had good arguments, why aren't they getting anywhere with them? If it's so obvious to like the man in the street that the buildings fell too fast, why isn't it obvious to the millions and millions of engineering students throughout the world? Why isn't Mr. Patel in India, who's studying his engineering degree, why doesn't he know? Why can't he tell just by looking at the videos that this is a collapse? Why can't the other millions of people who are also studying some kind of engineering, or the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of practicing engineers? Instead, you've got this like very small number of people, a tiny percentage of other engineers of the world, and most of them not really people with relevant engineering degrees in architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, who happen to be people who believe this conspiracy theory. But somehow everybody else, millions of qualified people, have missed this thing, which is so blatantly obvious. So you got to ask, what's going on there?
Well, I'm sure that what they would say is, that's because there's a cover-up, Mick, and that's why these people don't know about it. It's because the sheeple need to wake up and watch the documentaries, and then they'll be convinced. And
how would that even work? That's the question. How would you actually cover up like the opinions of millions of people? It's doesn't really make sense. And how would you cover up the investigations into the World Trade Center? There was half of the FBI was investigating 9/11 for 2 years afterwards, at least. And that's like 40,000 people, 40,000 special agents, all investigating. They would all have to be either in on the con, or you would have to somehow fool all of them. Just like you have to fool all of the scientists and the mathematicians and the engineers and the engineering students, not just the engineers, the engineering students. Like, how do you fool all these millions of people, and yet a few plucky people on YouTube manage to figure it out because it's obvious?
Right. Yeah, I noticed in a couple of the AE 9/11 Truth documentaries, something you hinted at earlier, is some of the so-called experts they cite, while yes, impressive in their particular fields, don't have credentials that are at all relevant. Like they have Lynn Margulis at one point, who, brilliant biologist, and she's responsible in large part for I think it's called the endosymbiotic theory of how different life forms early in Earth's history merged together to lead to eukaryotic life. And, well respected in that regard. But in terms of building demolition and engineering and stuff like that, I don't see how her expertise in biology, while impressive, is at all relevant to this field.
Yeah, yeah, and the argument usually given there is that I'm a scientist, I have an analytical brain, therefore I can figure these things out. But there's tens of millions of scientists in the world. There's like 3,000 members of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, and it's kind of dropping. If you look at their Facebook likes, it's been in a steady decline for the past few years, and a lot of them are just they're just regular people. They don't really have any deeper understanding of the physics of what happened. If you go to the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, I'm not sure if they still have it up now, but they used to have the position statements of all the people who believe, who are members of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And these position statements very rarely differ from the general public's conspiracy theory understanding of 9/11. They will say things like, "Oh, well, the buildings fell too fast, and I could tell by looking at them that that it wasn't right. I always felt it was too convenient that they fell in their own footprints." They say these very simplistic things, which obviously are not very good arguments, and they haven't done any real analysis. They haven't personally done any real analysis. A lot of them are just repeating the arguments that they've seen on things like loose change. A lot of them are just people who are engineers who build parking structures who watched loose change and they became convinced of it. And then they thought, because, I'm an engineer, I've got analytical brain, I can figure these things out. And this stuff they're saying in loose change makes a lot of sense. Therefore, I will go and join Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. But, again, there are tens of millions of qualified people in the world who could, look at the information and come to a conclusion. And, the vast majority of people who are qualified to talk about these things are not 9/11 truthers. Especially when you get into things like structural engineers, like actual structural engineers who design or analyze skyscrapers. I interviewed a guy, Douglas Friedman, who was a structural engineer who worked at the 9/11 site from September the 12th. He says he knows lots of structural engineers in New York. That's where he's based. He doesn't know anybody who was a structural engineer in New York who was also a 9/11 truther. It just, it's a tiny little niche community.
Yeah, I'm sure at this point a truther might retort to what we've been saying by coming back and being like, well, neither of you are structural engineers, so who are you to speak about the subject? And my response would simply be, we're not pretending to be experts. We're not featured in documentaries where the title is Experts Speak Out, and then it's like Anton Diebel sitting there talking about the subject. So that's the difference that I think is worth underlining. I would also just point out the basic fact that, look, experts can be wrong. They can be wrong about the facts. Even if you have an architect or an engineer with 30 years under his belt, expert credentials and so forth, he can simply be wrong about the facts. And the fact that he has those credentials doesn't make him infallible.
Yeah, and engineers do make mistakes. There's a classic mistake that's in engineering, which is the Hilton walkway disaster, where it was this, I think a lot of people died. It was like, I don't know, like 80 people or so died. And it was this walkway had been designed in this hotel, in the atrium of the hotel, and it was 2 levels, and it was suspended from a structure above with these very long beams, and they had like one at the bottom and one in the middle, and the design called for the long vertical columns to be threaded and then nuts threaded onto them, and then the beams go, the walkways go on these, and there was one here and then there was one lower down. And they thought this was a little bit too complicated of a design, so they changed it. So instead of it being like one long bar that's threaded all the way down, it's 2, and they just kind of had it offset and another bar over here. And the engineers signed off on this design change because they thought it's fine. Yeah, that just simplifies things, makes it easier. But they didn't realize that it actually doubled the amount of force that was on one part of the structure, because it would actually have to support both walkways instead of just one walkway. And this is something that they teach in engineering school now is that you can be kind of blind to something. Even though you're an actual professional engineer with many years of experience, you can look at something and it seems intuitively obvious to you that it's fine or it's not fine or whatever. Like they thought that there's no problem at all with making this design change. They actually completely signed off on it and it was fine. And what happened was the walkway collapsed because it was trying to support twice its own design limit, and 80 plus people died. So just because someone is an engineer doesn't mean that they're incapable of making mistakes. And you got to think that the people who fall for the 9/11 conspiracy theory are essentially that small percentage of engineers who, not maybe them personally, but a percentage of engineers would not have spotted this design flaw. And I would encourage people to go and look at it because it's not obvious. You look at the two designs. One, the bar goes straight down through both of them. One, it's kind of offset, and there's a different bar. It's not at all obvious why it's wrong. And lots of professional engineers, when presented with this thing, didn't see the error. So there's a bunch of people who are perhaps professional engineers who haven't seen the errors in architects and engineers for 9/11 truths argument, which is inevitable. It's inevitable that there's going to be some that don't see it, and then they get sucked in and become convinced, and it becomes hard for them to get out of it. But you would expect people there to be some people who don't actually get the right answer.
Now, if I didn't ask you this question, I know there'd be some truthers tearing their hair out. What about Building 7?
Building 7, that's a great one. It's Building 7 is very interesting. Building 7 looks like a controlled demolition from a kind of a cosmetic perspective. And
right.
From a distance, you see the building like it kind of falls straight down. It's obviously collapsing from the bottom. Now, there's an explanation as to why it did that. We know from the observation from the outside, we can tell that the penthouse collapsed at a certain time, which meant that the columns underneath the penthouse collapsed, which means that they probably collapsed all the way down from the bottom. The new theory is that they magically collapsed up at the top first, not at the bottom. But you can actually see the penthouse fall all the way through the building. If you look at the video, you see the windows deform all the way down. There's explanations as to why the building collapsed. The difficult explanations to convey to people, because you have to use analogies like a soda can. Like you said, the interior of the building collapsed first, and then the exterior, because it was a lot stronger than the interior in terms of resisting deformation, stood up a bit longer, and then the exterior buckled. It buckled near the base because there was this damage from the fires, from the impact of World Trade Center 1 falling against it, and it kind of collapsed straight down, kind of like a soda can being crushed. But it's hard to convey to people because you have to use analogies like that, and an analogy like a soda can being crushed doesn't really scale very well to Building 7. Like you say like, oh yeah, it's a soda can doesn't crush under its own weight, which obviously it doesn't because it's a lot smaller than Building 7. Then you have to try to explain to people like the square cube law and things like that. So it gets very complicated to explain. But I think, again, if you just try to explain people the fundamentals of what happened, explain to them that World Trade Center Building 1 collapsed. It was the first one to collapse, and it was just one block away from Building 7, and it damaged Building 7 a lot. There was a large gouge taken out of one corner. A huge number of buildings, of windows were broken on the south side, which you don't normally see in the videos and photos. And a lot of fires were started. A lot of fires were started in the building. And again, you have this issue with the fires looking small from a distance, but they're actually very, very large fires when you get close up. There's these huge infernos going on, and you see these entire floors engulfed by fire, and there you can see bits of the ceiling like sagging down because it's getting hot. And it's quite a big fire. If you actually look at the actual video of the fire, I have a little compilation video where the guy goes up close to the building. You can see the fires. It's actually roaring out of one side because of all the broken windows, like some kind of blast furnace. It's very, very strong fire. And, then you take people through the actual collapse. They take them through essentially the official story that the floors around column 79, 80, and 81 suffered a lot of damage, and some floors collapsed and it stripped away from the column. Once a column becomes unsupported from the side, then it simply collapses under its own weight. The column itself wasn't actually damaged that much by the fire, but because it's no longer supported from the side, it collapses under its own weight. And the first column to collapse, if you look at the plan view of the building, is the column that's supporting the most weight and is furthest away from the side. So it's the obvious, like it's the column that would collapse, and if it did collapse, that would lead to the collapse of the building. And then you show them the animations of the collapse of the interior of the building, and you show this column, these floors collapse, that would cause these columns to collapse, and then that propagates through the building, and then it kinks at the bottom, and that causes the collapse. And then they're going to argue, why was it collapsing at free fall speed? Because there's actually a portion of the collapse where the speed of the collapse is indistinguishable from free fall. And then you've got to kind of explain to them that once a column is buckled, it doesn't offer very much resistance. Now you think of, columns are normally straight up. Now if a column is bent, it's still a very strong column. It can still offer 5 tons of resistance. So you could stack 5 tons on top of it and it would still be fine. But if that column normally had to support 500 tons, which it did, or more, then it's only supporting 1% of its actual original load capacity. So 99% gone. Now 99% gone from the perspective of you looking outside and recording it with a crappy video camera is actually indistinguishable from 100% gone. So it falls down at about 99% of free fall because you've just got these bent columns underneath. But if you measure it on the video, 99% free fall, 100% free fall, pretty much indistinguishable, because you've just got 30 frames per second on NTSC video, which doesn't really have very good resolution. So there are these explanations, and you can actually give these explanations to people, and if people are intellectually honest and listen to them, you will actually get through to them. But a lot of the time, people just don't like to dig deep enough, and they don't like to actually listen to the other side, and it's a challenge.
Yeah, I would also ask, why would we see such a different collapse from Building 7 compared against the Twin Towers? Because you look at how the Twin Towers look during collapse. You have dust clouds, you have steel beams being shot outwards, and it's a completely different physical appearance from World Trade Center 7. So was it just for the two buildings, they're like, we're going to use these explosives? For World Trade Center 7, they decided we're going to do a totally different mechanism of collapse, maybe to throw people off the trail. I would be interested to hear what they have to say about that.
Yeah, what's the thought process going on there? Like they say, we're going to try to make the World Trade Center towers look like natural collapses, but then we're going to make World Trade Center 7 look like a controlled demolition.
Right.
is there actually supposedly some thought process going on there? It doesn't really make any sense in terms of why you would do this. Because you often hear the 9/11 truthers say, "Oh, it looked like a controlled demolition, so it must be a controlled demolition." But then they say, "Which one are you talking about? Which one looks like a controlled demolition?" And then they say, "Well, Building 7 looks like it." When they say, "Well, that means that the towers does not look like a controlled demolition." And they actually went and somebody asked a demolition expert, Danny Juenko, who he passed away a few years ago, but before that he was interviewed, I think, for Dutch TV. And they asked him about Building 7, and they showed him loose change. They showed the loose change, and the narrator saying, "Look at this building collapse like controlled demolition." And he was like, "Yeah, this happened on 9/11. This looks like a controlled demolition. I think it was a controlled demolition." But what they generally don't show you is in the same program, they also showed him looking at buildings 1 and 2. And he was like, "Oh, there's no way that could have been a controlled demolition. It doesn't look anything like a controlled demolition." So, if you're making the argument it looks like a controlled demolition, then you can't really use that argument for the Twin Towers. So what's actually going on there? And if it doesn't look like a control...
what's interesting is they point...
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, like, if they're saying the World Trade Center towers collapse looks like a controlled demolition, then what type of controlled demolition does it actually look like? Actually, the one it most closely resembles is a type of demolition called verinage, which doesn't use explosives. So if you're trying to make an argument that it looks like something, then it actually looks like something that doesn't hold to your argument, then you're picking and choosing. You're cherry picking
Right.
your arguments. Yeah. This looks like a controlled demolition. It doesn't, but that's because like they're trying to make it not look like a controlled demolition. It's just a convoluted argument that is way less satisfactory than the simple explanation, which does actually hold up to analysis of the facts.
Regarding Danny Juwenko, that European demolition expert you talked about, they'll actually point to his death as proof of some sort of sinister cover-up,
Yeah.
where they're like, my goodness, he came out, he said World Trade Center 7 looks like a demolition, and therefore that means the Illuminati, they killed him to silence him. And I look at that and I'm like, what about all of these other people and architects and engineers who are actual like activists in this field, like Richard Gage, for example? They're like, no, let him do his thing. We're just going to let him go around and publicly give a bunch of lectures. But Danny Juwenko, this guy in Europe who's not at all active in this field, that's the guy. We need to silence him. We need to concentrate our efforts on him. We need to make sure he gets killed. It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense. Yeah, and it would have been better, I think, to leave him alive, because he's the guy who's telling everybody that the World Trade Center towers are not controlled demolition, and there's no way that they could be demolition, and it doesn't make any sense. And it's entirely he saw the collapses, and he says, yeah, this is just what I would expect to see from the collapse from the fires and the impact damage. So, if you were actually like the Illuminati trying to cover things up, then you would want Danny Juwenko around, because he's the guy who actually debunks 9/11 truth.
One other thing I like to point out about Building 7 is the fact that it doesn't really add anything to the purported motive that they point to, because they say, oh, they brought down the towers to whip up the country in such a frenzy that they would support the Patriot Act and all kinds of legislation that would otherwise be hard to pass, and also lend support for our overseas war so that we can go and take some oil and make Dick Cheney rich and so forth. But you look at Building 7, it was totally cleared out. As far as I know, 0 people were killed as a result of its collapse, or very few people, because everyone was cleared out. There were no civilians inside. So it's like, why would they even bother rigging it up and bringing it down? Some truthers say they're like, oh, well, it was their operations base and they were covering up their tracks. Or they say there was a bunch of paperwork inside of there that they wanted to get rid of. It seems to me that bringing down a building to hide some evidence is overkill, to say the least.
Well, it seems like bringing down a building to start a war with in the Middle East is kind of overkill too. Like, you don't need to do that. There was no need to do this. And you think of how risky it was for them getting caught. They had to spend like weeks secretly installing massive amounts of explosives inside the building. They had to rig it so it all went off at the same time. They had to arrange for planes to fly into the building at exactly the right spot. I mean, the chances of that working exactly as they planned, and if it was like controlled demolition, they would need to have those planes fly into buildings at a specific spot for it to work, and it worked perfectly the first time. Yeah, it was like it's flawless execution. Now, the
And
terrorists
nobody
blew the
blew
planes
the
into the
whistle
buildings.
on it as well.
Yeah, the terrorists, all they had to do was hit the building somewhere. They didn't have to like pick a spot. They didn't have to do anything like that. But the amount of stuff that would actually have to go on for it to work successfully from the government's perspective, or the conspirator, the Illuminati's perspective, it's just an insane amount of risk to take for what? For something that you could have got quite easily by doing something else, like planting a bomb somewhere and then planting a little bit of evidence that bomb did something.
Right.
Yeah, it doesn't take very much to get people riled up. Yeah, you blow up a federal building if you want to do that. Kill some babies. Like, you could do. That's a far more effective way of doing it. Just something nice and simple. This incredibly complicated thing. It's not necessarily just the scale of it in terms of killing people, which is bad enough. Like, why would you kill all these people? including people that you might know. There's lots of people who died on 9/11 who were friends of people in power, or were in fact powerful people. Why would they do that? But even that aside, just the sheer complexity of it, I think people get so caught up in the details of like, oh, the building fell too fast, to really consider the implications of what they're actually suggesting, that somehow the government managed to formulate a plot using an explosive that had never been used before in human history for the demolition of a building, or pretty much anything else for that matter, that no one really had any experience of, and no one really even knows if it really exists in any useful form that's actually being used for anything. Getting that installed in the building, getting it all rigged up, getting all the floors rigged up, getting all this fake paper trail with the hijackers, getting these fake planes to fly in with remote control. Somehow, I don't know, they'd have to take over the plane and fly it in with remote control into the exact right spot, or they would have to, fly it to an army base and replace the plane with a different robot plane or something. It doesn't make any sense. But yeah, it's just so complicated. And I think it's really quite useful to have people step back and say, what actually do you think happened? Yeah, or sure, we understand you don't understand why the buildings fell so fast. We could talk about that if you want. But let's say the buildings did fall too fast. What does that imply? What does that imply about what actually happened? They often will just be like, oh well, we don't really know what happened. But force them to actually consider what must have happened for that to be an actual issue. And it's pretty complicated. And pretty ridiculous.
Yeah, I think it's very useful. I think it's very useful to get people to act, because a lot of the arguments and debates are had sort of at a superficial level where they just throw a talking point at you, and it's like, that's about it. That's the depth of it, where they're like, oh, nanothermite was used. But if you're actually tell me specifically, how this spray on nanothermite worked, what exactly were the charges like, how would that have enough energy and so forth, how exactly does the CIA knock on my door and recruit me to be a paid shill or whatever, when you actually walk through the specifics and you're like, no, break it down in detail and tell me, just saying it out loud for some people is enough to get them to realize how absurd it is. The last question I wanted to ask you about 9/11 truthism before we switch gears is, do you have any funny encounters or hilarious stories about the subject that you think are just worth recounting here?
Not really. I mean, I think the strangest things are actually when you get to talk to 9/11 truthers and you realize the depth of the denial of reality. But it's not. I wouldn't describe them as being funny stories. So I don't think I've really got anything for you there in that regard. But I think that people who believe in 9/11 truth are generally good people, but they've just developed a bit of a blind spot, and it can be kind of astonishing in a way to see just how strong that blind spot is, and how they get so fixated on one thing. Like the nanothermite or whatever, or the free fall stuff. It's just kind of, I don't know. It's just fascinating. But I don't know. Do you have funny stories about 9/11 truthers?
Not really. I wish, me being the one who asked the question, I wish I had something to sort of fall back on. I guess the one thing that I always find amusing is the relentless meme in the truther community, where if I post a video on the subject, you're a paid shill, you're a disinfo agent. It's look at every one of my 9/11 truther videos, and there's 10 comments that say that. It's like, who is paying you? It's I don't know. And that, and also what about Building 7? What about Building 7? It's like, the fact that it's so predictable, I think, is just kind of funny, where it's almost like a broken record.
Yeah. Well, you think about JFK assassination theories, and there's bits of that, like the magic bullet theory, which are essentially the Building 7 of the JFK theory, and that's been explained up, down, and sideways to everybody, and yet people are still bringing it up because they think it's a good argument because they saw it in Oliver Stone's JFK movie. So these things are not going to go away because people latch onto simple arguments, and it'll keep going forever. But I think if you get the good explanations out there, then it will minimize the amount of people who fall for this nonsense.
Yeah, agreed. Well said. Are there any other final points you'd like to make about 9/11 before we switch gears and talk about
9/11.
chemtrails?
No, I think if you want to talk to people who believe in 9/11, try to figure out what's the simplest thing about 9/11 that they don't actually believe in, and talk about things that are close to that. Ask them why they don't believe that. Like, ask them, if they don't think a cruise missile hit the Pentagon, ask them why they don't think a cruise missile hit the Pentagon. Or if they don't think it was destroyed by energy beams from space, ask them why they don't think that. And if you you need to focus on the area where they can actually have some doubt and some critical thinking. If you try to address things that are very deeply ingrained in them, like the idea that the buildings fell too fast, you might not get anywhere because they're so convinced that it's a strong argument. But if you ask them about why they believe one thing but not another, try to get them to think about what their actual basis for belief is and their thought process around that belief. I found that to be quite a good way of talking to people. And the plane hitting the Pentagon, I think, is a good topic to focus around for that type of thing.